to our intrepid president, Harriet Whiting, and also thank you to my incredible teammates, Amy Berger, my associate director, and Shelley Gameri, my director of development, who really worked flawlessly through a unprecedented 1 in 1,000 year flood to make the best of a challenging situation. I'd now like to call up AJC Dallas past president and AJC Board of Governors member Adam Lampert to introduce our speaker and our moderator.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Adam Lampert, and it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker and our moderator today. David Harris is our soon-to-be retired past CEO of the American Jewish Committee. David is on his farewell tour, and even though he's not sitting here with us, this is one of his last official conversations with an audience in his official capacity as CEO. So David took the reins of the AJC in 1990, and I think it's fair to say at that time, it was an organization trying to find its feet. And I think reflecting on 32 years of progress, I think there were probably few people at that time, maybe David, maybe his wife, maybe his mother, who could have foreseen the great success that David would achieve over that period of time. And it's in my humble estimation that this is one of the greatest Jewish advocacy organizations in the world, period. So David did this by pursuing the long game. David knew that if he wanted to create change on behalf of the Jewish people, that he would need to be patient. And so he could envision that change, and he was willing to embrace his patience. And if you think about patience, think about Ukraine today. Think about the fact that Ukraine is on the top of every newscast that you read. But Ukraine was top of list to David in 1991, when Ukraine separated from the Soviet Union, and the AJC was one of the first organizations to support that separation. We're all familiar with the Abraham Accords, which were finalized 2 years ago under the Trump administration, but probably few of us here are aware that there was quiet diplomacy for literally decades prior to this between David, his team at the AJC, and the leaders of Bahrain, Morocco, the UAE, and others, with the express purpose of creating diplomatic and economic relations between those states and the state of Israel. But David's not an ambassador. David's not a politician. But you would think by the reception he received around the world from world leaders that he was the Secretary of State or Justin Bieber. But in fact, he's not Justin Bieber. He does not work for the government of the United States. He does not work for the state of Israel. What David does do individually and as the leader of the American Jewish Committee is to represent a slate of ideals based on inalienable human rights that transcends over borders. And I'll just mention also that David has been recognized by foreign dignitaries more than 25 times, meaning that he's quite a stud on the global network scene. Our moderator is my good friend Margot Carter. Margot is an exceptional individual. She is a role model, and she is a true business leader here in Dallas. Over her business career, she has negotiated, bought, and sold hundreds of companies, and in industries from technology to construction to real estate. She has also is highly sought after as a board member and serves currently on both private and public boards. She's been recognized a lot, but most recently as the top 50 future innovator disruptor, I'm certain, for work done in applied intelligence, and she's twice earned a spot among the most powerful business leaders in North Texas and was recently recognized as the most influential director. On the civic side, I believe Margot has probably sat on most of the civic boards in our city. But in truth, close to home, she is the past president of AJC Dallas and also a past board member of the World Affairs Council, which just ties us all together as the happy family that we are. So with that, please welcome to the front Margot Carter and David Harris.
Hi, David. It's
Hi,
great to be
Margot.
here today with all of you. I met David about 20 plus years ago at an event very similar to this in New York City. And I was so impressed, and my heart, my soul, everything was touched by what David Harris had said. And I had never met a Jewish American advocate like him. And so here I am today, 24 years later, involved with AJC, and happy to be here today with you, David. I'd like to start with some questions. First of all, under your leadership, AJC has come to occupy a unique space as the diplomatic arm of the Jewish community. The late, great Prime Minister of Israel, Shimon Peres, named you the Foreign Minister of the Jewish people. Please share your thoughts on AJC's evolution into the premier organization for global Jewish advocacy.
Well, first of all, Margot, it's a great pleasure to be here with the World Affairs Council in Dallas and Fort Worth. Obviously, my plan was to be there in person. I tried mightily yesterday, but Mother Nature defeated us both at Newark Airport and LaGuardia Airport. So my apologies to everyone in attendance that I'm not there with you. I would have welcomed it. And my best wishes to my esteemed colleague, Joel Schweitzer. Adam, thank you for the very kind introduction and a history-making introduction to put me and Justin Bieber in the same breath. I think that's a first and probably a last. And Margot, it's lots of fun to be with you, having first met you in New York before you moved to Dallas, and now seeing you in your successful role in Dallas. I became the CEO of AJC in 1990. As Adam said, it was a rough patch for the organization, but I saw an opportunity which I thought was potentially history making. It began in 1988, 89. It continued through the end of 1991, and that was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rebirth of freedom in formerly Soviet satellite states. And for me, this represented an opportunity of historic dimensions for the United States, for the Jewish people, for the state of Israel, and yes, for AJC. I seized upon it, and from that evolved a sort of new notion of what advocacy should look like at AJC. And I'm very proud that AJC had a series of firsts. Adam mentioned the first to understand the importance of Ukraine's independence, but also the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And today, by the way, we mark, some of you will remember, that momentous day when 2 million people in the 3 Baltic states locked arms and collectively said no to Soviet tyranny and Soviet occupation. Today, we also mark the 83rd anniversary of the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, which gave Russia the chance to eat up the Baltic states and Eastern Poland. So big changes in 1989, 1990, 91. I wanted AJC to be a part of those changes. I wanted to reconnect with the Jewish world behind the Iron Curtain. I wanted to help encourage these countries to reestablish relations with Israel in a new approach. And I also wanted them to examine their own Holocaust histories, which had been buried and suppressed during the Cold War. So that's how it all began, Margot, and it's just been an upward trajectory from that point to until now.
Thank you, David. I know you can't see everyone here in the audience today, but the
I
room
can
is
only
packed.
see you.
I know, it's a disappointment because there's so many beautiful people here. There's probably about 150 people here in the audience. And they're all very excited to hear what you have to say. And I know that many of them came up to me personally and said that they were touched by the impact that you had on them throughout their years. Some of our friends here today have traveled with you and with AJC to the opening of the office that in Berlin, which was AJC was one of the first Jewish organizations to go to Germany and Berlin after World War II, after the Holocaust. And
Margot,
during
if you allow me, we were not one of the first, we were the first and the only for many years.
That's correct. Absolutely. And one of our friends here today is a cousin of Albert Einstein. You might know her. You've met her a few times, Karen Cortell-Reisman, and she specifically came up and said how much those trips, she took several trips with you, touched her. About 5 years ago, I traveled with AJC to the opening of the office in Warsaw, Poland, which was especially important to me. My grandparents came from Poland. My grandfather studied law at the University of Warsaw with Menachem Begin. And I know I see a few people in the audience here today. We're traveling with you to celebrate the first anniversary of the opening of the office in Abu Dhabi, which is an office focused on Arab and Jewish understanding. How did this expansion come to be? And what's the impact of having a permanent office in Abu Dhabi?
Opportunity, 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 Margot. Each of the offices we've opened, and we now have 13 offices overseas, has a story. I will test the patience of the audience by sharing 13 stories. But please believe me, there is a story, which all derives from this notion of global Jewish advocacy, which is AJC's theme song, if you will. We cannot be a global organization without having boots on the ground in key parts of the world, and being there not just once a year on a trip, but being there every day of the week, as a presence, as a partner, as an observer, as an advisor, as a critic at times. And the office in Abu Dhabi was one that some of us had dreamed about for many years. It seemed like an improbable dream, though. Could a Jewish organization closely identified with Israel really open an office in Abu Dhabi and not masquerade it with a phony name, but the AJC name, the AJC brand? And we did it because we have been traveling to the UAE for most of the last 30 years. And as they say in Arabic, shweya shweya, slowly, slowly, brick by brick, we built a foundation of trust, mutual confidence. And that helped to establish our credentials, number one, and number two. Adam referenced it. One cannot overstate the importance of the Abraham Accords. And I think the UAE in particular is a case study for the success of the Abraham Accords. There was such a yearning in the UAE, which I've seen with my own eyes, for a new relationship with Israel. And for those who follow it, or for those who will be coming with us next month to the UAE, you'll see it for yourself. I mean, this went from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. I mean, both countries wanted it. Look at the number of flights between the two countries. Look at the number of agreements that have been reached, including, by the way, a free trade agreement. Look at the skyrocketing bilateral trade. Look at foreign direct investment from each country into the other. Look at research and development. By the way, look at strategic cooperation. I mean, it's just going in every direction. It's partnership on steroids. And it's also because it took decades to reach a point that we've now reached. And AJC wants to be a part of it. I mean, well, look, at the end of the day, there are observers of history. We don't want to be an observer of history. There are prisoners of history. We don't want to be a prisoner of history. We want to be, if I may say, authors of history. And right now, there's a chance to author a new chapter, both in regional cooperation in the Middle East, widening the circle of peace, and also in writing a new chapter in Muslim-Jewish relations, which I believe are ripe for a kind of catapulting. We spent a great part of the 20th century at AJC helping to write a new chapter in Christian-Jewish relations. And we've seen a revolution in Christian-Jewish relations, especially between the Jewish people and the Catholic Church. We at AJC have said the 21st century for us is the century that's dedicated to Muslim-Jewish relations. So it's both in Texas and it's in the UAE. It's in New York and it's in Morocco. It's global. And that's exactly what we're undertaking.
Thank you, David. Last month, as co-chair of the Belfer Institute, which is the Latino, Latin American Affairs group for AJC, we traveled to Spain and we got to meet with King Felipe the Sixth to present him with an award honoring him and recognizing him for the Jewish Renaissance in Spain, for promoting Spanish citizenship for people with Spanish ancestry, people like Maimonides, the father of medicine's descendants. We learned when we were in Spain meeting with the president, the foreign minister, and a lot of other leaders that they are getting a lot of immigrants from Central and South America and they're welcoming them. How do the challenges in Latin America impact the Jewish community there? And what can you share about the important work that AJC's Belfer Institute for Latino and Latin American Affairs is doing to help face them?
So I'm very proud, Margot, that we established the Institute, that Robert Belfer of New York lent his name to the Institute. Our founding director, Dina Siegel-Van, I would call a force of nature, a real visionary who has established a goal of building relations between Latin America, the United States, and Israel, number one. Number two, building deeper ties with the Latino communities in the United States. And number three, building strong ties with individual Latin American countries and, of course, their Jewish communities. So put this all together, and that is the institute of which you are today the co-chair. And Latin America is a huge, diverse, complex region. It's sometimes neglected by the United States, which tends to look more to the east, across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe and the Middle East, and to the west, across the Pacific to Asia and Australasia. So I can't give you a simple answer to what's going on in Latin America today. There are Jewish communities in every country that I can think of, including very challenging countries today like Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, of course. There are friendly regimes, friendly to the United States, friendly to Israel, and there are regimes today that are quite hostile. We've seen some shifts in recent months and years from the right to the left, from countries like Colombia and Chile. As we had seen years before, shifts from the left to the right. So the only stability or the only predictability is the unpredictability of what's going on. I would say that some of our greatest challenges right now are with countries like Venezuela, which are hostile to the United States, hostile to Israel, very, very friendly to Iran, to Syria, to Russia, who are reported to be easy entry points for Hezbollah to penetrate to Latin America. We're told to be able to get Venezuelan passports and then to be able to move more freely in the region. We're also very much concerned by a place called the Tri-Border Area, which is where Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay meet. Places like Ciudad del Este, where Western intelligence agencies are monitoring very carefully for many years activity related to money laundering, drug trafficking, arms trafficking linked to the Middle East, groups like Hezbollah. And we have also marked a year ago the establishment by the OAS with the strong encouragement of AJC of the first position to monitor and combat anti-Semitism in Latin America, filled by Fernando Lautenberg, who, by the way, is also a member of your board, of the Belfer board. So lots of things going on, lots of strong, robust Jewish communities, good relations with Israel from countries like Uruguay, Colombia, until the change of power, now we have to see, Ecuador, Guatemala, and problems elsewhere. So a complex picture, but one very high on AJC's agenda.
Thank you, David. And I'd like to give a special shout out to our friend and partner, my friend, Consul General from Mexico, Francisco de la Torre, who's here with us today. And we're excited to be traveling to Mexico City in December, hopefully. So we'll talk more about that later. Thank you. So unfortunately, anti-Semitism is on the rise, both domestically and abroad. How has AJC mobilized its resources to take on this existential threat that emanates from so many sources? And what can we here in Dallas, Texas do?
Well, this is a new story and it's an old story, Margot, of course. I mean, anti-Semitism is widely referred to as the oldest social pathology in the world. And its history goes back literally thousands of years, as we know, and it's emerged in all kinds of permutations, and we have not yet found the Pfizer vaccine, unfortunately. It's also new in the sense that beginning in 2000, 2001, AJC was the first Jewish organization in the world to call out the resurgence of anti-Semitism at the time in Europe, principally in Western Europe. Countries like France, which has the third largest Jewish community in the world after Israel and the United States. And the position we took then, Margot, and it's a consistent position, whether it's confronting anti-Semitism in the United States or in Europe or Latin America or elsewhere, is the following. Anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem for Jews to solve. Anti-Semitism is a threat to the fabric and fiber of any society, and especially any liberal, democratic, and pluralistic society. And therefore, we expect governments to take a lead in responding to a threat to any part of their population. We are there to be supportive. We are there to encourage. When necessary, we're there to nudge. But it's not for Jews to solve the problem by ourselves. So that's number one. We need government leadership. Whatever the government, we need government leadership to stand with us and to combat anti-Semitism, and certainly not to look the other way, much less to fan the flames. Number two, we said from the beginning, and I repeat today, anti-Semitism comes from multiple sources. It does not come from a single source. The sources may vary depending on time and place and country, but the fact of the matter is that as we've tracked the resurgence of anti-Semitism, there are three main sources. We said so 22 years ago, we say so today. They are from the far right, the extreme right, the white supremacist movement, the neo-Nazi movement. We've seen that in the United States. We've seen that in parts of Europe and elsewhere. But anti-Semitism also comes from the far left. And this is a bit harder to explain because from the far left, it doesn't necessarily take a lethal form. It's not someone coming into the synagogue in Pittsburgh and killing 11 worshipers or marching through the streets of Charlottesville shouting, "Jews will not replace us." But ask Jewish and pro-Israel children on almost any campus in the United States what their main threat is on the campus. And they'll tell you it comes from the classroom or the dormitory or the quad or student government, and that it comes from the far left. And then the third source, which I'll call jihadist. I will not call it Muslim because that would be to suggest that all Muslims are involved, and that's far from the truth, but jihadists who pervert the teaching of Islam and have used violence against Jews. In fact, in Europe, where this began, virtually every single physical attack against Jews, including fatal attacks against Jews, from Toulouse to Paris multiple times, to Brussels, to Copenhagen, to Burgas, Bulgaria, every single one came with Allahu Akbar as the perhaps the last words of the terrorists or the attackers. They believed that they were doing this in God's name. So those are the three main sources, and we have said, Margot, from the beginning, the proper response is to be swivel-headed. It's not to play politics. It's not to weaponize anti-Semitism for some partisan purpose. Rather, if you're serious about fighting anti-Semitism, whether in the United States or in Mexico, or in Argentina, or in France, or in Poland, or wherever it may be, call it out where it is, and don't put on political filters which see certain things and are blind to other things. And number four, anti-Semitism cannot be resolved by a speech or tweet or a press release. Obviously, words are important. When they come from political leaders especially, they're very important. But words of condemnation are necessary but insufficient. You want to fight anti-Semitism, you have to play the long game. And that involves everything from schools and education to policing, law enforcement, data collection, data analysis, hate crime statistics, go through it all. It's a multi-front response. And too often what we're seeing, Margot, especially in the United States, if I can speak candidly, is a sense that anti-Semitism is not always taken as seriously as other hate crimes. That somehow the notion that Jews appear to be a successful community, and if they're a successful community, how can they claim to be targeted or vulnerable in the way other communities assert that they're targeted or vulnerable? And what we are saying to the world, to our own government, is no. There's no hierarchy of racism and anti-Semitism. An attack on an African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina, an attack on a synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, an attack on a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, are all assaults on human dignity and on our sense of self. As open, pluralistic societies, we need to recognize the threats, we need to be there for each other, and we need to outlast the haters among us who would divide and potentially destroy us.
Thank you, David. Before we entertain questions from the audience, the title of our program today is Lessons Learned from a Lifetime of Jewish Advocacy. Can you please share a few of those lessons that we might not have covered during our conversation?
Sure. Well, one thing I've learned is never to despair. You know, it's very easy to succumb at any moment in time to kind of a doomsday scenario oh my gosh, things look awful, things are getting worse, nothing will ever change for the better. When I began in 1975, Margot, which was when I, for myself, surprisingly, even improbably entered the Jewish world as a civil servant. Look, for example, at the Soviet Union. I was very much motivated then by the fact that there were literally millions of Jews held captive behind the Iron Curtain, who were targeted by a policy of what I would call cultural genocide. So that was not the genocide of Auschwitz and Buchenwald and Babi Yar and Treblinka. It was the quiet, if you will, genocide of destroying a national identity, a history, a faith. That was the Soviet policy. And of course, for the Soviet Union, it meant preventing people from leaving. So here we are in 1975, millions of Jews trapped behind the Iron Curtain, and a few brave, courageous Jews from behind the Iron Curtain saying to the world in Russian, Atpusti narod moy. In Hebrew, if they learned Hebrew, Shelach et ami. In English, let my people go. It was an astonishingly brave act, which landed many of them in prison, in internal exile, in unemployment, with threats to their families. But there they were. They challenged the Kremlin. Fast forward from 1975. By 1991, the Soviet Union was gone, dead and buried. There were 15 successor states: Russia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Armenia, etc., etc. In each one, a Jewish community reemerged. The Jewish community that had been targeted, repressed for decades, threatened, intimidated, reemerged, underscoring the indomitability of Jewish identity. So, one, I saw with my own eyes. Two, I saw some 2 million Jews from behind the Iron Curtain eventually able to leave, to start a new life in Israel, or here in the United States, including in Dallas, in Canada, or perhaps surprisingly to many, in Germany. So I've seen a miracle. I've seen other miracles. I've seen the miracle of the rescue of Jews from Ethiopia. I've been to Ethiopia. I was there in the early 80s. I saw African Jews who believed they were the only Jews left in the world and who prayed to what they believed was a mythical Jerusalem. Most not realizing there was a Jerusalem then. There was a state of Israel then. And I saw with my own eyes the length to which Israel went, perhaps more than any other country in history, to liberate Africans from Africa who were enslaved, who were oppressed, who were persecuted in Ethiopia, to bring them to new lives and redemption in the state of Israel. And I've seen, to come back to an earlier question you asked, Margot, in 1975, when I began my journey, not one single Arab country, not one, had open diplomatic relations with Israel. Fast forward, and today, depending on how you count Sudan, either 5 or 6 Arab countries have full diplomatic relations with Israel, and others are on the sidelines watching, and some quietly engaging, not yet ready for open public ceremonies, but quietly engaging. So I think there's more to come. So the central lesson that I've learned and that I would wish to impart to younger people, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, especially in an era today where the word patience doesn't figure, where people seek instant gratification. Play the long game. Play the long game. Stick with it. Miracles can happen. And even if you're a person of faith, bless you if you are, but miracles are helped by human participation. It was Jews in Russia who were supported by both Jews and non-Jews around the world in their struggle for freedom, who created a modern-day Exodus. It was Ethiopian Jews who took on the communist regime of Colonel Mengistu in Addis Ababa. Against all the odds, prevailed, again with the help of Israelis, with the help of the US government, including a Texan named George H.W. Bush at the time. Things can change. Don't succumb to despair. That is the single most important lesson that I learned on my 47-year journey in the Jewish world, and that I hope others will learn again, whether it's applied within the Jewish world or in the larger space. Lord knows, in that larger space, Margot, in a country like ours, which is so fractured, so polarized, in some cases so despairing of its own future, we need the doers, the dreamers and the doers to say together, the American experiment is far from over. The best days for this country lie ahead, just as I would say as a proud Jew, the best days for the Jewish people lie ahead. Now go out and prove that both propositions are right.
Thank you, David, for being my hero, my mentor, and my friend. And so many people here and all around the world feel the same way. I'd like to open it up to questions, and I hand it over to my friend and director of AJC, Joel Schweitzer.
Margot,
Thanks,
thank you
Margot.
for your able moderation of today's conversation. David, thank you for inspiring each and every one of us. I want to open the floor to questions, and there will be mics brought around. In the back here, David.
Meanwhile, Margot, I have a question for you. How's your son?
He's great. He enjoyed hearing you speak last night, and he said he'd like to have a conversation in person with you.
If I can't make it to Dallas, I hope to be in New York one day. Joel, over to you.
You got it. David Cameron has a question.
Yes, sir. Thank you for.
Is this the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom?
Yes.
I'm honored and humbled.
So, thank you for speaking to us. So I'm in education. I'm actually trying to build a high-tech, futuristic, state-of-the-art Renaissance school in Dallas, specifically in Fair Park. And like you're saying, I feel like I'm getting the same kind of pushback. I'm very much involved in terms of reaching out on both sides. I'm apolitical. Politics shouldn't be in the lives of our children. And within our school, you'll see young boys, the yarmulkes, young girls with hijabs, kids with disabilities, all in the same classroom growing up together. There's no separation. And so how do I navigate through the politics? Because this is crazy. One of my partners, he said the next step we should meet the Dallas City mayor, Dallas City manager, because we need their approval, and the big banks and the smaller financial firms will be our head players in terms of funding the project, along with government support for the underserved families where we get funding for them. And then the other families can pay their yearly tuition. So that's my question to you. How do I navigate through all this politics?
David, I'm very sympathetic to your question, but I'm also at a big disadvantage because I'm not in Dallas and I'm not familiar with your project, and I therefore can't really understand the obstacles that you're encountering and the hurdles that you have to jump. So my answer will be, I'm afraid, unsatisfying to you, and I apologize for that. I can only draw what I said a moment ago. If you believe in something, and you believe that the something has a social good to it, it adds to the social well-being of the community, of the state, of the nation. There will always be those who, for a variety of reasons, will want to slow it down or stop it or derail it. That's true of the school you're trying to create. I think most people in the nonprofit world and in the political world will tell you, by the way, in local and state and national government will tell you the exact same thing. You have to bring to this work an incredibly strong spine, incredibly strong, not weak knees, a fierce determination, and an ability to both communicate your story and to enlist allies, and do so strategically. So that you understand, you know, if you map the decision-making apparatus that affects, in this case, your school, how do you map it? And once you map it, how do you properly approach and ideally enlist those who should be your supporters and who become your boosters, your cheerleaders, your advocates? So it's taking a good idea, which is often the easier part of the process, and then driving it relentlessly to make sure that you achieve the understanding for your project, you achieve the support for your project, and you're not deterred by those who, for reasons of bureaucracy or envy or inertia, are going to want to slow it down or stop it. Go for it. As a middle name, adopt the name Bulldozer.
Next question. Yes, Art.
Does China have any role to play in this discussion today in any of these matters?
Sorry, yes. I think China, in any discussion on our world today and the challenges of the 21st century, China has, as my children would say, a ginormous role to play. And at AJC, it hasn't come up yet, but we established an Asia Pacific Institute already at the end of the 1980s. So we've been traveling to the region for decades, to China, to Japan, to South Korea, to Singapore, to Indonesia, to Australia, to New Zealand, to India, to Sri Lanka, to many countries, believing that in every way imaginable, Asia and the Pacific would become, if you will, the key theater of the 21st century. So we have said and continue to believe that how the US is able to manage its bilateral relationship with China may be the single most important geopolitical question of the 21st century. And obviously, representing the American Jewish Committee, there is not a large Jewish community in China. There are a few thousand Jews, pretty much all expatriates who are working in business or diplomacy or journalism in China, but we're all affected by world developments. And we all would like to believe that we can avoid a new Cold War, which would once again divide the world, but I'm not sure that we're capable of achieving that goal. One last thing I would say, more broadly to your question, if I may call you Art, and I'm speaking really more as a citizen than in my AJC role. I was extremely frustrated, if not angry, during the 2020 presidential debates, the primary debates, and then the larger debate before November. I think it's too much theater and too little substance, and I was particularly concerned that questions about China, U.S. policy towards China, larger geopolitical developments were given short shrift. And I think we, voters, members of places like the World Affairs Council, need to demand of our politicians and need to demand of those who are speaking to our politicians, for example, on television, enough of the silliness, enough of the theater. What happened on February 24th, 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, should be a powerful reminder to everyone that who sits in the presidency is enormously consequential. And it doesn't matter what flavor ice cream he or she might eat or how well they ride a bicycle or not. The real question is, in a world in which the Vladimir Putins and the Xi Jinpings and the Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei and the dear leader in Pyongyang, North Korea, a world in which they threaten the world order, in which they may refer to tactical nuclear weapons as a possible weapon of choice, in which they threaten or invade neighboring countries, is a world that demands political leaders in our country, the leader of the free world, who can face these challenges. So start demanding more of our candidates, focusing less on trivialities and silliness and nonsense, and more on the hard issues. Do they understand these issues? Are they serious about how to engage these issues? I don't care if they're Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives. Are they knowledgeable? Are they focused or not? This country deserves better than we've gotten from those debates and the public discussions. The world is an increasingly dangerous place again. And if we're going to emerge safe and secure, it's only going to be because of American leadership. So who our leaders are on the local, county, state, and especially national levels matter enormously. We need to expect more of our officials.
I believe Bob Grossman has a question.
Hello, David.
Hello, Bob.
How are you? Thank you for all you've done all these years. I have a quick, want to pick up on the theme that you were just talking about. It's not a surprise that authoritarianism is sort of on the rise in the world, and democracies are somewhat challenged, not only in the United States, but abroad. How concerned are you about how that affects the Jewish people? And you know, what do you think the path forward is?
If I were running for president, I'd give you my campaign speech now, Bob. But among other things, I've learned that even at the age of 72, I'm way too young to run for president in this country. So let's give it a few more years, at least. I'm very concerned, and I tend to be, for those of you who know me, quite mild-mannered about what I see as the unfolding of two countries within the United States. Two countries with very different understandings of our country's history, our country's place in the world. And I could illustrate it in many ways, Bob. I could begin just by focusing on 2 years, 1619 and 1620 as the starting point. 1619, according to the New York Times and some others, was when the first slaves arrived in the United States. And American history has to be seen through the prism of slavery and race from then until now. The 1620 narrative, which is the one that I learned in school, growing up in the 50s and 60s, is the narrative that spoke and speaks about the United States as the shining city on the hill. In some respects, the New Jerusalem, the land that welcomed pilgrims seeking religious freedom, and yes, made mistakes along the way, but ultimately is the story of a unique, indeed exceptional America. Well, these are not small differences, Bob, between those who believe that America was launched as a racist enterprise, and race continues to define virtually every aspect of American life to this day, with disparate impact and disparate outcome. And those who believe that America is ultimately a force for good and a shining city on the hill. So how to bridge that fundamental gap in understanding, to me, is part of the challenge. To make it even worse, at least as far as I'm concerned, when I was growing up, news in America was essentially news that was devoid of partisan content. You went to watch Walter Cronkite or Eric Sevareid or Huntley and Brinkley or the others at the time in order to receive what they believed was nonpartisan news and for you to reach your own conclusions. Now, how many of us today have that model? To the contrary, I would argue, we speak about gated communities. I would argue that we now live in culturally and intellectually gated communities in America, increasingly. That if I'm on one side of the political spectrum, from morning till night, I live in a media and informational ecosystem, which tends to completely reinforce my beliefs. I don't want to be challenged. I want to be reinforced. And the other side goes to its ecosystem with the exact same effect. So where are the intellectual meeting points? Once upon a time, there were places like the Chautauqua Institute in upstate New York, which prided itself on open debate and discussion. I think those are becoming rarities. And among the things that I would do, Bob, and it's only a drop in the bucket, but if I could wave a magic wand for a day as the Educational Commissioner of the United States, I would make debating in every high school in America obligatory. I'm a product myself of debating. I spent many years in very competitive debating, but it was all voluntary. And it was choosing debating over soccer or football or glee club. But one of the things that I learned in debating was there can be more than one thoughtful, sincere way of looking at major public policy issues. Otherwise, we're living in ideological, doctrinal bubbles. So in debating, I didn't get to choose the side that I defended. It was assigned to me. David, today you'll be on the side of everyone should have the right to weapons under the Second Amendment, and tomorrow you'll take the same issue and debate the other side. And my goal at the time was not to score political points. My goal was to be a good debater and ideally win a few tournaments and get a few trophies. And I learned, wow, I thought there was only one way of looking at an issue. And I thought everyone who disagreed with me must by definition be a nut or an extremist or a zealot. By the way, nuts and extremists and zealots do exist. I'm not deleting them. But a lot of people who want to be fair-minded need to be brought back together again in civil discussion. Even the word civility somehow seems very antiquated today. It's, it sounds like, an old grammarian trying to tell you, you put a period, not a semicolon there. I mean, for most people in America today, who cares what a semicolon is? Well, I think we need to restore a certain civility, a certain respect for other points of view. As I said, debating in order to encourage young people to think and to see more than one way of looking at issues. But right now, I'm not sure I see the pathway. At the end of the day, Bob, my last point, I want to believe that, no situation in a democratic society is static. Nothing is ever permanent. I'm not happy with much of what I see today from the populist, ethno-nationalist, neo-isolationist wing of the Republican Party. And I'm not happy with the woke, cancel culture, ideology of the far left wing of the Democratic Party. And I want to believe that even though we're witnessing both of these political extremes today, that there will be a reaction and America will rediscover the broad center. It wasn't that long ago that John McCain and Joe Lieberman were best friends. It wasn't that long ago that Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch were best friends. And even when they disagreed, they understood the importance of engaging with each other and looking for places where they could find common purpose. It can't be beyond this great country to rediscover what was not so long ago, because otherwise, heading into two countries within one risks the potential of political instability, indeed of violence. And that should be the last thing that any of us would want.
David, thank you. I think you really put a bow on it for us this afternoon. Really appreciate the thoughtful questions, appreciate everyone's time and flexibility, both in New York and here in Dallas. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we break. I want to thank our sponsors one more time, Rob and Linda Swartz and Ariel and Daniel Tobin. Thank you. Margot mentioned earlier that our dear friend, Consul General Francisco de la Torre is in the audience this afternoon. I want to let everyone know, and hopefully you saw these flyers at registration. We have an installation of art by Jewish-Mexican artist Jose Sacal that the consulate, AJC, the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History, and the UTD Center for U.S. Latin American Initiatives are bringing together to campus this fall. It's actually going to be installed over the weekend, and then it will be there will be an opening reception that everyone is invited to, open to the public, on September 12th, and we hope you'll join us for that. There's information on these flyers at the front. I also want to welcome my my new friend, the brand new CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas, Igor Alterman, who's joined us this morning. Thank you, Igor. As well as Madison Johnson, who is on the staff of City Council member Kara Mendelson. Madison, thank you for being here. I know Kara would much rather be with us here today than in the special executive session she's currently in. She is a self-described David Harris fangirl, and you can quote her on that. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for joining us. Thank you to our partners with the World Affairs Council. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, Margot. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, World Affairs Council. Bye-bye from New York.
Wow, that was amazing. I had a family. Oh, it's so shiny. I wonder. I wonder. Oh, you're gonna love it. Argentina is very European. It's like kind of like a European. It's like, like, oh, oh, perfect. Oh, that'll be amazing. Carolyn.